The Chicago song that asks lots of big questions. Wasn't just about brass when they recorded Harry Truman. I'm Morgan Cunningham. It's WTIC News Talk 1080. I almost went with This Land Is Your Land. I thought that it was appropriate for our show, for our conversation. And then, I don't know, somehow Harry Truman ended up in my head. And I said, ooh, let's go with that. I have fun with the bumper music. What can I say? It's WTIC, and our guest this hour is Norm Pattis, who you probably know best as a lawyer in Connecticut who has worked a number of cases that have gotten significant media attention in the last few years. I don't have to run through the list. You probably know who I'm talking about and the cases I'm referring to. But what we're focusing on this hour is his work as a bookstore owner, the owner of Whitlock's Book Barn. Now, look, books represent, as we kind of touched on before the bottom hour news, books represent history. They represent free speech. And as far as the issue of free speech goes, Norm, some would say that you're really comfortable in speaking your mind. And in other words, it would suggest to me that there are some people who are not so confident about the free speech that they have. Maybe they read a book and it challenges their mind, but they're perhaps too scared to talk about it. But I just want to know, Norm, where does your confidence come from?
Didn't the poet Robert Burns once say, "Oh, would some gift the gift you give us," or that's translated, "Oh, would some gift the gift you give us, to see ourselves as others see us." I don't experience myself as confident. I experience myself as questioning, as restless, and always looking for the thing that gives the best fit, that gives the data the best fit. So, for example, in the law, a case will come in and the person will have a problem, and it'll be my job to get the best resolution to that problem that I can. And so I will learn as much as I can about the problem, the case, the person, the facts, the witnesses, and then I'll stop thinking about it for a while, and I'll let the answers come to me, usually in the middle of the night. And I'm the same way with the world at large. When I was a kid, the thing I wanted most was to know God. And I can't say that has changed over time. And so to that end, I spent some time in Switzerland between college and graduate school, at a religious retreat in the Alps, studied with a St. Augustine scholar at Columbia. And lo and behold, in recent years, I've returned to reread the Confessions and reconciled with the Catholic Church probably 6 or 7 years ago. Start each day reading the daily missal, and have recently read the Bible through, and we'll start it again. I think that life, life is a mystery. Immanuel Kant once said that two things fill them with wonder: the starry heavens above, and the moral law within. And I'm with them on that. Being in the world is an amazing thing. And being in the world in a courtroom or being in a community is, in my view, a third astonishing thing. What gives government the power to tell us what to do? And so with respect to free speech, I think speech at its best is the human spirit confronting the world around it and expressing the truth, as the declarant sees it. That is the classic value of free speech. And any attempt to limit it arbitrarily by someone who asserts to know better is offensive to me. So it's not for nothing that at 70 years old I'm still wandering around with a ponytail. People say, "Well, you must have issues with authority." Damn right I do. How is it that we came to be governed as we are, and is this the best way to do it? And aren't there better ways? And isn't every attempt to govern a compromise with the rights of people who live at the margins? And don't most of the most interesting people live at the margins? That's where I grew up, with marginal characters eking out an existence well outside the mainstream. And they are entitled to dignity and respect just as much as the banker or the butcher or the baker or the candlestick maker.
Norm, why is it that people sometimes struggle with free speech? We're hearing it so much in the news these days, people who are getting canceled online because of something they say on social media. Maybe it's an idea that is not so popular, for lack of a better term. Why is that? Why are we hearing so much about that in 2025? You think people would be okay with it, right? It's the 21st century. It's supposed to be accepting, but no, not so much.
I think people are afraid of a loss of identity and a loss of community. We don't have whatever it is that defines a civilization or a society is some consensus on what's valuable. Cicero, I think, nailed it a couple of millennia ago when he said a constitution or a society isn't just any collection of people. It's a people who are bound together by common interests and a common conception of right. And I focus on that latter thing. What is it to be a human? What is it to be? What is it to strive for excellence? I think that in our times, things have become particularly fraught because we no longer have a consensus on core values. There's no longer an agreement about what it means to be an excellent human being. As we've verged from character to identity, we've somehow placed an ultimate value on each person's ability to express himself, no matter what that expression is. And so some people are threatened by that. Some people feel their right to express themselves, no matter how idiosyncratic their way of life may be, is abridged. And I think we're all struggling for a sense of community, a sense of safety in a world that's perilous. Say what you will about the causes of climate change. I mean, we live at the sufferance of forces beyond our control. We find ourselves in a world that is habitable, but increasingly becoming inhabitable. And how are we going to learn to live together to make the most of the resources that we can marshal together? It's a perpetual challenge. So I think that people who are at the outliers, people who challenge the common norms, are always viewed with suspicion. In our time, this has become even more accelerated because we don't even have common norms anymore. And so people tend to view the marketplace of ideas as a zero-sum game. You can express your identity, but if you do you eliminate mine? And so I think we need to find a sense of community again. And I think that we will. I think in American history, there have been a series of what are known as great awakenings, where there have been events that drove people back to a search for a common religious identity. I think we're on the cusp of another one, and I'm looking forward to seeing what happens next.
I want to draw on something that you wrote in your blog, Norm. This takes us back about 3 years. You had written about the author Salman Rushdie, who obviously is known for the controversial book, The Satanic Verses. And in 2022, while he was giving a talk in upstate New York, he was attacked. And you wrote about it and specifically said, quote, "You want cancel culture? This is where it leads. Inevitable. The murderous silencing of dissent," end quote. In other words, what you're saying here is that even though in the U.S., where we have freedom of speech, it's not totally immune. You're not totally immune from attacks when you kind of break away from whatever the norm is, so to speak. Is that kind of what you're saying there?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that, a sense of modesty in the face of the unknown is a becoming characteristic. But people who seem to think they know it all and then decide that they need to protect it at the expense of another person's right to inquire, those are the true tyrants. Those are the people that scare me. So, the fun part about owning a bookstore is the ability to house heterodoxic literature and invite people to come in and browse it and to be challenged.
What books would you recommend to somebody? Not necessarily if they walk into your book barn, Whitlock's Book Barn in Bethany, but just in general. Maybe they're there for sale at your book barn, I don't know. But just if you were to give some people some book titles that you would say, hey, you've got to read these, what would they be?
Well, yeah, I'm reading one right now that I can't put down, and it just hit the press. It's Ian McEwan's What We Can Know. And it's set a century or so from now, and it's an author's, the protagonist is a scholar trying to recover and retrieve a lost poem. And a poem that celebrated love and nature. And the poem was written, in 2014, I think, I can't remember, but in our time. And it's about how people come to know the world and what we can know about it. It's a beautiful book. Another new book that I just read the other day, The Last Bookstore on Earth, it was called. And, I picked it up because I thought, hey, I own a bookstore. And it's written by a young Smith College graduate, and it's about longing and love and reconciling oneself to the world. So those are good pieces of literature. I think the St. Augustine's Confessions remains one of the best books I've ever read. And I return to that book from time to time when I look at the debate about evolving artificial intelligence, because what Augustine's book is a book about longing to know God. On the very first page, I will find my rest when I find my rest in Thee, O Lord. And I think that our search to know God is fundamental. And we will never design a machine that experiences longing in the way that Augustine did. So when I read Augustine, I immediately find a soulmate. The book of Psalms in the Old Testament, in the Bible, I read some of those almost every day, and have several of them committed to memory. It's often the case that I will recite with a defendant awaiting for a verdict, Psalm 23, or when a person is overwhelmed with anxiety as they approach a trial, we'll read Psalms together. In terms of books of relatively recent philosophy, my never completed doctoral dissertation at Columbia was on David Hume, who I thought was obviously, well, not obviously, he's an atheist, but he taught me a sense of humor in a godless world. At least that's how I experienced the world at that point. I loved Russian literature as a kid. Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is a classic discussion of the wages of nihilism, and what happens when we become gods unto ourselves, and how a person can recover a full sense of humility by repentance. Thoreau's Walden Pond. I remember just stumbling upon that in Detroit when I was about 15 or 16 and reading it. And I was just transported by the sense of solitude and satisfaction that would come of living simply. And I remember trying to grow a garden of peas, in Detroit. It didn't work out too well. So those are some of the titles that come to mind and sustain me, some new, some old. I would say, reading the Bible, candidly, is a lost art these days. I talk to juries. I'll try a case a month. I'll try 8 or 9 cases a year, usually pretty serious cases involving murder, child abuse, or political corruption. I'm trying one now. And, in the end, when you talk to jurors in closing arguments, if you make a biblical allusion, people don't know them. And, you ask yourself, what's wrong with what's going on in our world right now? We don't have common reference points. A civilization, a culture is a broad agreement, not necessarily on the details, but on themes. And I think the theme of repentance, the theme of justice, the theme of being open to grace, the theme of mercy, the theme of loving one's neighbor as oneself, and loving the Lord thy God with all your heart, mind, body, and soul. These were good enough for our civilization for several millennia. People, when you talk about them now, look at you as if they don't know what you're talking about.
They're the foundation of our nation.
Yeah,
in some ways. The ideas, the concepts.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. So if these are age-old questions, and you're reading some of these materials that go back centuries, or at least decades in some cases, do you feel that you have come up with a better answer? If you're searching for knowledge, do you feel that you've come up with a better answer to any of these age-old questions that you've mentioned?
No, not really. Candidly, I'm quite disappointed in the course my life has taken in that regard. I'd always thought I'd discover a better oven, and find a way to bake a better loaf of bread. But in the end, I've largely, in the last couple of years, gone largely silent. I'm not writing a column anymore. I'm not really doing many interviews. I had a radio show for a while. I'm not doing that. And I'm really not blogging even. I think that what I'm doing is trying to cultivate a sense of silence and humility. And I think that as I read through the daily missal, the Roman Catholic missal every morning, and reacquaint myself with the Old Testament and the New Testament, I ask myself, what were these wise men and women talking about, and what can I learn from them? And might my silence be worth a whole lot more than another column or another book?
I'm Morgan Cunningham. He's Norm Pattis. He's deep, too. Let me just say that much. He's an attorney who happens to own a bookstore on the side, Whitlock's Book Barn, and we'll continue with Norm wrap up in just a few moments.
He's amplifying voices, news and talk. Morgan Cunningham.
Are you saying, gee, I didn't know any of this yet? Are you? Find me on socials at MC News Talk.